Welcome back to the web coding series. We did HTML last week, and now we're going to jump into some CSS so that we can actually style the stuff that you write in HTML that doesn't look very pretty by default. And then next week, we'll go through some more intermediate CSS topics. There's a lot you can do with CSS, a lot more than HTML. And then I'll show you through one option of how you can deploy your content to the web. So CSS. What is it? So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Let's break that down. Cascading means that if you apply a style to the parent element, it'll cascade down to the child element and also apply it to that. So when we were working with HTML last week and we were nesting those elements or indenting them in between other ones, that's basically what this will do, is if you apply it to that parent one that holds all of the ones inside, your style will apply to all of the elements that you put inside of that one as well. Style is just the style stuff, fonts, colors, transitions, animations, positioning, stuff like that, all done with CSS. And then the sheets part is just the document. CSS describes how HTML elements should be styled. So that's why whenever you learn web development, most people start with HTML and then they move to CSS because you need that HTML to target the specific elements of your website and style it how you would like. And it can also control styling of multiple web pages at once. So I will show you how you link your HTML code to your CSS code. And you can use that same CSS style sheet for multiple HTML pages. An example of why you would want to do that, we're going to be building kind of a brief portfolio site. And if you have multiple different project pages, but you want them all to be styled the same, you can just link that same CSS style sheet. You can also do the inverse, where you have multiple CSS style sheets applied to the same HTML web page. There's a little bit of a caveat with that, which I'll go through in a little bit. So just like we broke down an HTML element last week to describe how it is constructed, we're going to do that with the CSS rule, which is the basis of how you code in CSS. So the rule is the entire P curly bracket, color, blue, semicolon, curly bracket. It starts with what is called a selector, and this is how we actually choose which HTML elements we are going to apply the styling to. So in this case, it is just P, which stands for that paragraph element. So this style will apply to every paragraph element in our HTML document. And then it's followed by a declaration block, which is contained within this orange border that I created. You can have multiple declarations. This example just has one, but we'll go through some that have multiple. And the declaration has a property, which is the type of styling that you want to change: color, background color, font family, font size. We'll go through a bunch. And then the value is the actual specifics that you want to do. So in this case, it's blue. The CSS rule will change every body text to have a blue fill. Cool. In terms of specificity, which is how the browsers determine which styles to apply to which elements, there is an order. So at the very bottom is universal, and we'll go through that universal selector when we start coding. That is one that selects every element, and you can apply a style to that. Obviously, if you did a universal selector and you did something that changes the font family, so changing from like a Times New Roman to like an Arial, it's not going to change anything with your image just because it doesn't have a text with it. But it would change everything else: the headings, the paragraph, anything that has a text. Next specific is when you do element. So if you specifically targeted the paragraph one, like we did in this slide, you can also do specifically heading 1, specifically heading 2s. That's a little bit more specific than the universal. And then at the end of last week, we went through the class and those ID attributes, and they are also in this order. So class, you can assign to multiple HTML elements, and that is a little bit more specific than element. And then ID, you can only do to 1. And so that's the most specific. So if you have a paragraph element that has an ID of paragraph, you target the ID paragraph and you apply it to be color blue. but then you use the element one to select all paragraph and you do color green, that one that has that ID will be blue instead of green. And we'll see that when we start some coding stuff. Here's that explanation of the style sheets. I'll show you how you can write all the different ways with CSS. There's multiple different ways. You can add multiple style sheets like I did up here. And then these are inline styles and the style element, which we'll go through as well. But basically how your browser reads an HTML document is from the top to the bottom. So if in this one, I have changed all my paragraph text to yellow, and this one I have changed all of it to pink. It's first going to read through, see, change it to yellow. So it will, and then it will change it to pink because that's the next thing it sees. But then I go down and I see there's this style element and they read, oh, change all of it to green. So it's going to be green. But then the specific one, I have style equals color blue. So this one will be blue. Everything else will be green. So basically just know top down with the stuff. So if you have multiple style sheets, the second one will take precedence if it conflicts with anything in the first one. An example of when you might want to use this is if you are working for a company and they have very specific branding guidelines, maybe around fonts and the colors and the icons, but they're a little bit more lax with the positioning of stuff on a page. You might have your branding guidelines in one styles that are on top, but then you can use your own underneath and you can override anything that you need for your specific project. That's an example of when you would use it, but just know that the second one, if anything conflicts with the first, it will always be the second one that the browser shows. That makes sense? And then one last thing before we jump into some coding and see what we're going to be doing today is colors. There are multiple ways you can determine which color that the CSS should read. So this first one is RGB, or red, green, blue. And there are 3 values. All can go up to 255. And what this does is it determines how much red, how much green, and how much blue is in your color. RGBA is very similar. The A stands for alpha, or the opacity. So this is on a scale of 1 or 0 to 1. So in this case, it's 0.5, which means that it's that same color from before, but 50% transparent. HSL is hue, saturation, and lightness. You might also see HSB, hue, saturation, brightness, same thing. The hue is a number between 0 and 360. And this is the color on a wheel, where 0 and 360 is red, and then 120 is blue, no, green. 120 is green, and then 240 is blue. And then the colors in between, you would find those values. Saturation, you put in as a percentage. 0% means it's gray, and 100% means it's fully colored. So if I did this, and 255 is around a bluish color, so it'd be, if I had 100%, it would be fully blue. But if I start scaling back that percentage, it'll get more and more gray. So if you want kind of like a blue gray, you would just tone that down. Lightness can be a little funky. It's out of 100% as well. 0% is fully dark, so black. 100% is fully light, so white. And then right in the middle at 50% is whatever color you're doing. So no light or no shadow is added to that color. So this would actually show up as fully white, even though I selected kind of a bluish color. If I put it to 50, it would be this 255. HSLA, same thing. That A stands for the opacity on a scale of 1 to 0. And then the last one, and this is my favorite one, it's just super easy, is the hexadecimal code. This is basically another way to write RGB. I just find that I like it because it's really short. And a lot of times when you search up like, what color is this? What color is that? Or if you use Adobe Color, it'll give you that hex code value. And it's just easy to copy paste because it's like 7 characters at max. Cool. Let's get to some coding stuff. If Acrobat will let me get out of here. Cool. So I sent you the zip file. We'll go through what it looks like, but this is how it renders with just HTML. So it's very out of whack, very not fun. There's some things that I put in here that we didn't do last week, like the button instead of a link. And I'll show you that in the code. And then whenever I'm doing some CSS stuff, I do like to have a visual representation of what I'm trying to go for. Just so that as you start coding, if you start getting lost, you can kind of go back to this. So I mocked it up a little bit in Figma, pretty roughly. This is what we're going to shoot for in the next 2 sessions. Cool. So now if we go to VS Code, oh yes. Figma. Figma is a design tool specifically for like UI UX design. So if I go to my Figma account, as a student, you can get the Figma Pro like subscription thing for free if you just search like Figma education or something like that. I made this last spring with some students. So I mocked up like a coffee shop app, and you can like make it a prototype and prototypes. It's really fun. So I would recommend if you're interested in designing stuff like this, you could do that. But we're thinking of teaching Figma again next spring, if you'll still be around. Cool. So if you go to VS Code, and if you don't already have it open, you can go File, Open Folder, and then navigate to that folder. It's Web Coding Series CSS, and then click Open. And I have some stuff over here. I don't have any audio, no CSS yet, and I don't have any project pages or videos. But if you want to play around with after this and adding stuff, making it a little bit more fleshed out, that's what those are there for. I have my icons and images that we're using. They're all linked. And then index.html. This is our homepage. I try to put as many comments in here so you know what section is what. So quickly, I just want to go through some things in the HTML that I put in here that we didn't cover last week. And those would include some of these semantics. So you'll see that I have header, I have nav, we have section again. We went through that last week. Semantic HTML elements are designed to be a little bit more accessible. It allows browsers to more comprehensively understand what this type of element is instead of making everything a div. So in this case, I was like, this is my header section. I want the browser to know this is my header. So I used header instead of div. But you'll notice down here for my nav bar, I did put a div, and that's just because it's just going to be this bar that I'm styling instead of something that is kind of its own entity and unique that a browser needs to recognize as separate. Main is where you put all your main content. We have sections, and there's a footer down here as well. I did put those buttons, as I mentioned. So I put the A element around the button. So the button does come with this default, really old styling, which we're going to change. But I put the A around it with the link to where I want it to open, or in this case, this is the mail one. I think that's about it. But you can always just Google like semantic HTML, buttons HTML, and you'll find a lot of resources. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to show you how you do those inline CSS styles. And we'll go through more about the actual writing of CSS in a bit. If you wanted to write them all as in your HTML document, you can do that open caret style closing, and then anything in here that you write will be your CSS. So if I put H1, and you don't really know what this all does yet, but if I put font size to like 100 pixels, really blow it up, and I save all, it should make my title super big. So you can always use the style element in HTML to write a bunch of CSS code in here. But basically what that does is it makes your document super big. It makes it a little bit harder to navigate and read, but that is one option. The other one is with the style attribute. So if I wanted to do the same thing, I can delete that. I don't want the dictionary to open. And then if I go and find my H1 here, I add the attribute of style equals, and then in quotations, I can do the font size 100 pixels, and it didn't change anything because I did the same exact styling code. Those are two ways that you can add CSS into your HTML documents. Most people do this next one, though, and that is using an external CSS style sheet. This is best for in case if there's something wrong with your style sheet that all of your content is not corrupted and your website doesn't show anything at all. So what we'll do is if you click on CSS in the folder and see this down tick, that means that it's open, and you can click this button that's like a paper icon with this plus, and if you hover over it, it says new file, and then we get to name our file. We're going to name it styles.css. It's a pretty standard name for a style sheet, but you could have multiple ones named projects.css if you want specific project ones, or navigation if you want it specifically for navigation, all that stuff. And we can click enter and create our new document within that folder. The nice thing about CSS is you don't have to do all of this doc type HTML stuff. You can just start writing your CSS code. But first we want to link it in our HTML document. And so we do that with that same link element that we used with that browser tab icon. So under this styles comment in the head section, let's add in our HTML document, let's add link, and then rel equals, and this is the relationship. And if you start typing, it should be style sheet is the name. And this just basically confirms to the browser, like, this is CSS code. And then we do href again, and then we can do period slash, and then we get our file browser. We can click CSS and then styles CSS, which is our file. And then we can just close that off. So what this does is it just basically tells HTML and the browser specifically, hey, we have a linked file here and it's our style sheet. And this is where we're going to add all of our CSS styling in this document. We all good on that? Oh no. Is there a part you're stuck on?
You completely downloaded it.
Yes. So if you go to your file browser and you just open that folder of web coding series CSS, is it in there? Oh, interesting. You try re-downloading it with. I see. If you open both, does any of them have everything?
No, mine looks like his. Like I pretty much have all of them.
In the zip file, did you have two folders?
I just have this one.
Interesting.
OSX folder. And another folder says web coding series, and then that one index, icons, and images. And then all the other ones are in the other folder.
Great. Yeah, if you want to just like highlight those and drag them to that other folder and just kind of combine and make a complete folder, that should work. That's weird. I don't know why that happened. I'll give you like a minute to do that. So
when you say HTML or CSS, it's
CSS.
oh, really?
Yeah. We all good?
Index.
Yeah. So on index, we just added this link relationship as style sheet, and then we linked that CSS stuff that we created. I can come over and take a look. Yeah, I would say CSS is a little bit more difficult because
HTML is just like the content or stuff. On CSS to like kind of positions, there's animations you can do it, so it's a lot.
So within zip, there was these I did this.
I am, yeah.
I'll try to send this document directly to you and see what happens. Because maybe it was because something like that, it zipped it and then it changed something about it. So let's do that real quick. And what's your email? Okay. All right. So hopefully that works. Yes. All right. Cool. Be cool if I move on a little bit while you do that. Awesome. So the first thing that I want to show you this time in CSS is how to write a comment. We did that a little bit after we learned some HTML, but I want to do that from the get-go so we can start organizing our styles. It's a little bit different than how we did it in HTML. And how you do it is you put this / and then an asterisk, and then anything you write here will be code or a comment. And so I'm going to put universal styles, or basically just things that are going to apply to everything. And I'm going to put another asterisk and then that / again to end my comment. So whenever you want to write a comment in CSS, it's / asterisk, whatever you want to put as your comment, another asterisk, and then another / just like that. So now I find that working with CSS and HTML in split panes really helps because we use CSS to target specific HTML. So I'm actually going to right click over index.html when I have my CSS file selected. And then I'm going to click split left. And this just allows me to see my HTML code on one side, and then I can see my CSS on the other. So how I did that is there's those two files. I had styles.css selected. I right-clicked on index.html, and then I click split left. And then I just opened it up in another pane.
Two, but I also think I might have deleted something. There's no other. Oh, I see. Yeah. It's kind of, oh, sorry. So this is like the changes we made to this one. You might just do that. Maybe what was I supposed to put? Maybe this one. The link that is link route.
You're welcome. Cool. Now I have my HTML code on my left-hand side. I have my CSS on my right. This is just going to help whenever I'm trying to scroll through here and find out what some of those IDs or those class attribute values are. So I type them directly in CSS. If you don't type it exactly, it's not going to work. So I'm going to put enter. So we have a new line. And the first selector that we're going to use is the universal selector, which selects every element in your HTML document. And it's as simple as putting an asterisk. So the asterisk is the universal selector. I can press space and then that opening curly bracket, and CSS will automatically add that closing curly bracket for me. You can write all your declarations on this one line. I like to press and enter, and then I'll put all of my declarations on their own line. That just helps me read through it a little bit better. Cool. So the first thing that we're going to do in here is we're actually going to change the font. By default, Chrome gave me this font, which maybe doesn't fit what I'm looking for. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the font using the font family property. And so it's font hyphen family. And you'll notice that it gives me a bunch of these options. You don't have to use these. You can write whatever you want. What I like to do is go to cssfontstack.com. You don't need to do this today. You can just look at it in the future. This is the complete collection of web-safe fonts. Basically, what that means is that most computers will have these fonts already installed. And so your content's going to show up exactly how you anticipate it for every user that's visiting your site. So I can see that stuff like Arial Black, 98% of Windows and 96% of Mac computers have it. So this would be a good option. Really, all of these would be. I'm doing this Century Gothic one for our example today. You'll notice that it is a little bit lower than some of the other ones though. So we're also going to add some fallback fonts, which basically allows the browser to first read Century Gothic and be like, cool, I'll use that font if the user has it on their computer. If they don't, they'll move to the next one and they'll try to display your content with that font, and then so on and so forth. So if you go back to VS Code, in font family, I'm going to put a hyphen or an apostrophe and then type out Century Gothic. The reason that I need these single quotes is that this allows the browser to know that Century Gothic is a pair of words. If you put them separately, it might not render perfectly. Then I'm going to move my cursor to after the closing quote and put a comma and a space. And then this allows me to specify a fallback font. So if you are visiting my site and your computer doesn't have Century Gothic, it's going to try to use this next font. In the CSS font stack website, whenever you go into one, it'll show you the whole stack that you could use. And you can just literally copy paste the code here, but we'll type it out. So the next one is Century Gothic as one word. And we'll put another comma and a space. And then it's Apple Gothic as one word, which may be Apple's version. And then at the very end, you should always include a generic keyword. So in this case, it's sans serif with a hyphen in between. Serifs, if you don't know what those are when there's those little, I don't know what they're called, but there's those little extra things on the T's and the I's to make it a little different. And sans serif don't have that. And so generally, if you're going to pick a bunch of serif fonts, at the end, you would use the serif generic keyword. In this case, it's sans serif, and we'll put a semicolon at the very end. And this will close off our declaration. So basically, now browsers will first look for Century Gothic. If not, they'll look for Century Gothic as a one word, and then they'll use Apple Gothic. And then if all else fails, they'll just pick a sans serif font for us to use. Cool. So I'm going to click File, Save All, and then I'm going to just go back to my project. And if I refresh, you'll see that the font changed across all of the things that have text displayed. Now I want to go through the font size, which is another way you can configure your fonts. I'm going to create a new section in my CSS with a new comment that is called header styles, and I'll do the ending like that. So now I'm going to show you another way that you can change fonts with the selector, and that's by using that element selector. That, remember, that's the next specific one. And so how you do that is you actually just copy whatever the element name in HTML is. So in these cases, there's like H1, there's P for paragraph. If you're going to do an image, you do IMG. In this case, we're going to do A. So this is going to do every link text, and we'll do that opening curly bracket. And then in here, we will put font hyphen size, and then that colon. This is the property where you change the size of your font. And we can do this with a number of different units that CSS does. I'm just going to do pixels. So I'm going to put 20 px and then a semicolon. And this will change the font size for all of my link elements to 20 pixels. I'll file save all so you can see what that looks like. So these links up here got a little bit bigger. I don't think the view more did because it's actually a button, but that's how you do it. Yeah.
It's changing for me on the website because I just opened the website. It wasn't supposed to have it open before.
So you can have it open whenever. If you go to so you went to the folder and you opened index in Chrome. Are you saving in VS Code? Okay.
Let's see for that period mark, even the managing file stuff. So that's how we did that. Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, you're welcome.
Sorry, can you show that on the screen?
Yeah, so that was in the header, and it was this link element. So it's open caret link rel equals quotes style sheet quotes href equals quotes, and then that file path, and then quotes, and then that end caret. All right, so that's font size. Now let's do some more font stuff. Okay, so let's create another section in our CSS with a comment. And this one will do project card styles is what I'm going to name it, which is basically those things in my mockup that are like this. That's just what I'm naming them. So in here, we're going to learn a couple things with selectors. The first is that next specific one, which is the class. So if we go down to our project cards in our HTML, which I have that comment of project card so we know which one it is, I can see that I have class IDs. I can have this class with the buttons, all of that good stuff. So I want to change the font styling of this button. Now, if I'm going to have multiple buttons, like down here, I have another view more. Down here, I have one about emailing us. You can use the classes to separate them. In this case, it's actually, we could have done this with just using the button one, but we're going to do it with classes and IDs. So for class, what you would do is the selector, you would put a period, and then you would type the class value exactly how it is in here. So this is view hyphen more in my CSS, and I'll do that opening and closing bracket. For some reason, I'm getting this. Well, hopefully it works. Now I want to add my email button, because down here I didn't assign that class of view more. So instead of having to have each element separated with its own thing, we can actually add another element to our selector. And how you would do that is you just add a comma and a space. And then now we can add our other selector to also apply all of our rules in this declaration block too. So this one is an ID for this email button. And we do the same exact workflow like we did for class, but instead of that period, we do the pound symbol, but then we type out the rest of the ID name. So in this case, it's email button. So period view more will select every element that has class equals view more. And then our pound email button will select the element that has an ID equals email button. That makes sense? Cool. So in HTML, when we did the that EM element for italics, you could also configure that with CSS. And how you would do that is the font -style property. And then the value would just be the word italic. And it should show up in your browser, like drop down when you start typing. And then always end with the semicolon. Every declaration that we write should have that semicolon at the end. And I'm also going to change the font size on this one. So at the end of my declaration, I can enter a new line, and I'm going to do that font size again. But this time I'm going to do 18 pixels. So this is our first example of a declaration block that has multiple declarations. And so basically what that just allows you to do is you don't have to keep writing selector, add the new declaration block and changing your rules. You can just put all of the rules in that one rule, if that makes sense. So now I'm going to save all again so that I can see the stuff in my browser tab, and I'm going to refresh, and I see that my view more and my email button, they now are italicized. The words are a little bit bigger. They're looking closer to what I want. The last font stuff that I want to specifically change right now is related to these links right here. So by default, all of the links are going to have that underlining effect, but I want it to change a little bit. And I also want it to be all capitalized, but with the first letter being slightly bigger than the rest. So we're going to go back to VS Code, and that is in our navigation menu. So I'm going to show you how to change this selector to be a little bit more specific, because right now it's going to apply to every single a element, so every single link element. But sometimes you only want the ones that are within a certain type of element. So how you do that is you first start off by typing the parent element. So in this case, it's nav, and then a space, and then you write that child element. So in this case, it's A. So what this will do is it's now going to select every single link element that is nested within a nav element. So this won't change for us because this reigns true. But if I were to have a link down here somewhere that wasn't in a nav element, it's no longer going to be impacted by this rule. So we're going to do two things. The first thing is we're going to change that font where it's all caps. So we can do font -variant and then a colon, and we'll see normal, which is the default. And then the other one that we generally use is the small caps. So if you want to put in small caps, or you can just select it and then end with a semicolon. And before we see that change, I'm also going to show you how to get rid of that underline, because I don't want the underline from my link. I want it to be a little bit more modern. And we do that with text -decoration. And you can see that there's all of these things when you press the colon. There's all of these options. If you want it to be dashed, dotted, double, I'm going to click none, or type in none too, and that will just remove that underline. So if I file save all and then I go refresh, I can see those changes here. So I no longer see that underline, which is that text decoration, and then it's in that small caps where the first one is kind of big and bolded, but then the rest is still capitalized, just slightly smaller. Cool. We all good on the font stuff?
Maybe it's because
Let's see.
so the property colon, and then it'll be value 7. Yeah, so the first one, which is actually those one of the two those. I wanna save all of them. Maybe like one of them was missed. Yeah, or something. Thank you. Yeah.
Another reason why CSS is tricky. Cool. So now let's go through some of those color stuff. I showed you in the slides where there's all of these versions of colors and how you can add those. There's also one more I did not include in here that I'm just remembering. And that is predefined colors. So if I just show you what that looks like. So there's 140 colors that you can just use the name of. There's not a lot of colors, honestly, out of all the colors that are on the internet right now. But if you want something as simple as black or white, or you want this generic blue, these are standard colors that you can just use that keyword. We'll use some of those, but we're also going to use some specific colors with the other options. So we're going to do kind of a big selector under our universal styles. So this one, I want to select a number of colors and I'm going to make them white. And so this is because we're going to change the background color later. So you might see a lot of text disappear because right now the background's white, but we're going to change that background later. So let's do the period header title for the class. We'll do a comma. We'll also add our nav. We'll also add our H1. We'll also add H3. We'll also do period project hyphen card space P. So this is going to be all of our paragraph elements within an element that has a class of project card. So you can see you can get very specific with the selectors. We are going to add the period view more to the view more class. We're also going to add the pound email button. So the element with an ID of email button. And then last but not least, we're going to add footer. So now this is going to target every element that has a class of header title, every nav element, every heading 1 element, every H3 or heading 3 element, every paragraph text within project card class elements, the whole view more class, the email button ID, and the footer. And we'll add the opening squiggly bracket and the closing one. And how you change the foreground color, so in text, that's the text color, is color, colon. So just basic color will be your foreground color. Now you'll notice they automatically give us some options for those predefined colors that we can just use those keywords. We are going to use white and then semicolon. What's nice about VS Code is it gives you this little box where it shows you that color, and then you could even go in over here and change it using this picker if you wanted. But I'm just going to go back, make it back to white, and I'm going to save all, and then I'm going to go back to my project, and you're going to notice so much text disappear because I made it white on a white background. But we're going to start adding some background colors as well so that we see those pop up again. Cool. So let's do some of that. So under our header styles, let's go and add the ID nav hyphen bar. And if you're ever curious about which elements are actually changing, you can just go and find in here where ID equals nav bar. So that is right here, this div. So I'm applying the background color to the div, which contains all of this stuff that I want in that navigation bar up here. Okay, so I am going to add my opening and closing brackets. And then to change the background color, it is background hyphen color. And then we'll put the colon. And then here, we're going to put our color. I'm going to use that hex code value for that specific color in the mockup. So we can put another pound symbol. And then it's 7BBFC5. It's 7BBFC5. And then if you put a semicolon there, I'm going to file save all again. And when I go back here, I can see that background color applied to that section. Cool. So I'm just going to go through my notes and see where else we applied that color. Okay. So under our project card styles section, I am going to add the class of project card, which is the period project hyphen card. And then I'm also going to change that background color to that same value, which was 7 BBFC5. Because I've already added it once to my document, Visual Studio Code should show it to you in that dropdown once you type that first value. Which I'm also going to create another section for footer styles, which is the stuff at the very bottom, and I'm going to do the same workflow for my footer elements, background color, and finish it off like that. So this is going to apply to all of my project cards. That background color is going to apply to my full footer. And so now when I file save all, we're going to see that be applied to our sections. Now they all bleed together right now. Next week, we'll go through like the separations, positioning them in the right place. Okay, so there's a couple other background colors that I wanted to put in here. We're gonna start by doing our buttons again some more. So we already changed their font style and their size. So if we go back to this class view more and ID email button, let's add a new declaration for our background color. We're going to use a different one. We're going to use that pink color, which is F47A69, and then semicolon at the end. Cool. And let me see if there's any other one. There's one more. So this one is a little bit of a fun selector that is going to give you a preview of some advanced stuff. So far we've worked with classes that we have specifically outlined in our HTML. But CSS also allows you to target what are called pseudo classes. And these are things that are basically determined by the browser, but is not something that you specified. Usually you will use pseudo classes with links to determine any kind of variations if someone hovers over it or if someone has visited the link and they're coming back. And we're going to do it when they hover. So I'm going to do our pound button and then email hyphen button to target that the ID of email button. But before I start writing my actual rule, I'm going to put a colon here and I'm going to type in hover. So now I'm targeting that button and only changing the stuff when it is hovered over. So if I put my little bracket, I'm going to put background color, and this time I'm going to use E3DB00, which is this like bright yellow color. But because the text is white, if you hover over it, it's not going to show up very well. So I'm also going to change the color value, which is our text color, to black. All right. So I'm going to file save all and show you how that looks. So now we have all of our buttons have that pink background, but I decided with the email one that when you hover over it, it should change to be this yellow background and black text. We feeling good on colors? Gotcha. I can come take a look again. You can look at that. Okay. All right, cool. All right. So now I want to go through some stuff about the backgrounds of stuff. We're not really going to save much of these, actually, if any, but what you can do is if I go to let's do my nav bar. So right now it's background color of this blue, but I can also go in here, and if I wanted to change the transparency of that whole element, I can put opacity, and then I will put a number from 0 to 1, just like we were talking about with that alpha. So if I put 0.3, I file save all, I'll see that everything in that header is now 30% opaque, or 70% transparency is the opposite. A case where you'd probably use this is if you wanted to add like text over an image, and like when you're hovering over it, like you have like a thumbnail, and then when you hover over it, it will show like the project name or something. You might want to add like a transparency to the background when you hover over it so that the text is more readable. But we're gonna get rid of that because it looks not great. Another thing that you can do is you can change the background to be an image. So if you did background hyphen image colon. And then in here, you would do URL. And then in the parentheses, you would put the quotations and then the link to your image. So if I were to find one real quick, maybe it's because I have a color selected. So another thing that you can do is you can always comment out code if you want to keep it, but not working for some reason. But basically, that's how you do it. Background image, and then you add the URL in there. If you have a image that you want to make a gradient, because it would basically show the image like multiple times from side to side, you can always do background repeat, and then with a value of repeat X. It's a little hard to describe without actually being able to see it, but what this would do is it would repeat it from like fully across, so that like if you had like an image that was like a texture or a gradient, and instead of it being like little strips of columns, this would just make it kind of fill the whole page and repeat more beautifully as a background. And another thing that you can do is you can determine whether the background image should be fixed or should be scrolled with the content. And you do that with the background attachment one. And you have some values of fixed, local, scroll. So fix would be it just kind of stays, and then scroll, it would scroll with the content as you scroll down. Cool. So let's get this project to look a little bit closer to that mock-up that I made. So the first thing that I want to go through is let's do our buttons. Right now, they're still pretty close to that kind of default styling. We did change the color, we did change the background color and the font size and the italics, but it still has that kind of ugly black border around it. I want to get rid of that. It's a little too tight also with the view more text and the border. So I want to add some more space to that. And those are all stuff that we can do with CSS. So if I go back down to my project card style section, and I have my buttons with the .view more and hashtag email button, we can change some stuff about the border. So border style is the first one. And this is where we can change how that border appears, very similarly to how we could change how that underlined appeared when we use the text decoration. So we could do dashed ones, dotted ones, double ones. I am just going to put none here. And then if I save all and I go back, I can see that I don't have a border around it anymore. Your code might still be a little funky right now, but yes.
Okay, yeah, I think that part works.
Okay, cool, weird. All right. So then the next part that I want to show you is actually I'm going to show you with Chrome DevTools. So when I go into Chrome and I right click and click inspect, I mentioned this, I believe, last week where you can see the HTML code, but under the styles tab, you can also see the CSS code. So if I were to click on this button up here, I can select the specific element that I want to see the code for. So I'm going to click this view more button, and I can see that this is the CSS code I've already written and that I've saved. Here's some other ones that are a little less specific as well. And then here are those universal styles. So all of these are stuff that I've written in my code. This one is user agent style sheet. This is basically Chrome's CSS code that is on default. And so if you ever want to look at what is on here, you can do that. But the thing I really wanted to show you was this kind of handy tool. Let me zoom in on that a little bit. Okay, so with each piece of content, this is how you can determine the size that it's going to take up on the page. So this blue section in the middle is our actual content size. You can see that highlighted in our view more on our left. So this is just the size of the actual content. Border is something that we removed, and this was those edges around. Even if the border is not visible, there can still be a value specified, but you can still set it to none if you wanted kind of like a hidden sort of border. Padding, which is always helpful, is the space between the actual content and the border. So in this case, this border is non-existent, it's hidden basically around our button. So if I wanted to add more space between my content, the text, and the border around it, I would change this padding value, and we're going to do that. And then outside of the border, we also have our margin, and our margin is the distance between one element's border and the next one. So if I had like a bunch of these buttons in a row and they were all kind of stacked up against each other, and I wanted to spread them out a little bit more, I could add values to these margins. I'm going to show you that so that we can also get it off of this side. Cool. So let's jump back into VS Code, and we're back at our View More and Email Button section. So this is targeting all of those buttons for us. Now we did add this border style property and set it to none to remove that default border around those buttons to make it look a little bit better, a little bit more modern. The first thing that we're going to do is increase that spacing between the text and our border. And we do that using padding. So as I start typing padding, you'll notice that we have padding, padding left, padding top, padding bottom, padding right, and all these other ones. Those first 5 ones are the ones that we're going to kind of talk about right now. The first one is actually a shorthand, which allows you to configure left, top, bottom, and right all at once. So how it goes in this shorthand, which I will show you after we go through these individually, is that it will go left or top, right, bottom, left. So clockwise when you think about it. Let's add them individually and then we'll reconfigure them with the shorthand. So we're going to do padding hyphen top, and we're going to set it to 10 pixels. We're going to enter. We'll do padding hyphen bottom, and we'll set it also to 10 pixels. So 10 px. For padding hyphen left, we'll do 25, and we'll do the same for padding hyphen right, is 25 pixels as well. So I'm going to file save all with this one, go back to my Chrome, and I'm going to refresh it. And now we see that we have a lot more space between our text and that border. So this just allows it where things don't feel as cramped. You can just add more space to the element between the content and its border. Now to write this with shorthand, there is a couple ways you can do it. So the first way is going to include, I'm going to delete these 4 actually, is if you wanted to put all 4 in a row. So this would be padding, just the word padding, not adding top, bottom, left, right. And then it goes top, right, bottom, left. So we would do 10 pixels, space, 25 pixels, space, 10 pixels, space, 25 pixels, space. Or semicolon, sorry. And then if I file save all and I refresh, you'll see that nothing changed. I just rewrote that 4 lines of code in 1 line, but there's an even shorter way that we can write this. So when you use this padding shorthand, you can also just specify 2 values. So if I were to delete these 10 pixels and 25 pixels on the end, and I were to just have 1 of each, and I file save all, I'm going to go back. You see, again, it didn't change because this first value is going to apply to both the top and the bottom. The second one is going to apply to both the left and the right. So if you know that your padding needs to be set to the same for both left and right, or both top and bottom, you can just specify that like this. If it was the same padding for every side, you can just put padding and then that 1 value. This one is going to change because we're changing the top and bottom from 10 to 25. So it looks more like that. But this has 25 pixels of padding on each side. I'm going to go back and add that 10 because I like that look better. Cool. We all good with the padding? Nice. So now we're going to do the margins, which is the side outside of the border between the elements. And if I start typing margin, you'll notice the same exact thing as with the padding. So we have margin, which is the shorthand, margin top, margin bottom, margin left, and margin right. And all of those same rules apply. You can do the specific individual ones if you wanted to configure just one. You can use the margin shorthand to configure multiple of them. And it's that same order of top, right, bottom, left. So for this one, let's use the margin shorthand. So just margin, colon. And I just kind of want to get it away from this image, and I want to get it away from this side. So I actually don't want anything to change on the top. So I'm going to put 0. You don't have to put pixels. It's usually dynamic enough. I'm going to put 0 again because I don't want anything to change on the right. But for both the bottom and the left, I want to do 10 pixels. And so I'm going to save all. And when I refresh, the padding went back to where I changed it to 10 pixels. And then it moved a little bit from my margin and from that bottom. So I have some more space to breathe. And if you ever want to see stuff, you can always right click in Chrome, do inspect, go find it using this element picker under the styles thing. You can always keep scrolling. I have it really zoomed in, but they have this handy dandy graph so that you can determine where things are. And it kind of highlights in the actual stuff what you're configuring. Cool. So one last thing I want to do with my border on this button to make it look more like this, more modern, and that is going to be the border radius. So if I create a new line and I do border hyphen radius and then colon, border radius is essentially the corners. So as I increase this value, it is going to curve those corners more. Usually with this, I just play around with numbers until it looks pretty good. I found out for this one that 25 pixels semicolon was what made it look like I wanted it to. I'm going to file save all. And if I go back, I get this perfectly rounded corners. So it looks like a modern button actually. Cool. So now we all good? There's two last things that I want to show you. So the first one is, if you notice when I hover over these links, it gives me that pointer cursor that's kind of like almost like a Mickey Mouse hand. But if I scroll down and I see with the email one, when I hover, it doesn't. Usually that allows us to determine like, hey, this is a clickable thing. If we don't have any other visual styling to indicate that. I just want to match this functionality to that default one. And this is just Chrome's default CSS. It does it for this kind of element. It doesn't for this. So if I go back to my pseudo class, email button hover, and I can add a new property called cursor, and you can get a bunch of different options. This one that I'm specifically looking for is pointer and then semicolon. And I'm adding it to the hover because I only want it to show up when you're hovering over that element. And so when I go back and I refresh, I can see that now it's matching that functionality. Cool. So the last thing is, you'll notice we haven't changed anything about this really blown up image. We haven't changed anything about why the Instagram icon link is massive. Guess we really want people to go to our Instagram. But this one's pretty easy with sizing. It's exactly like this height and width stuff that we did it with our images. Now we just can do it in CSS as well. So if we go and let's create a new section in our CSS with our comments. I'm just going to name it image styles. I like to separate out the CSS code based on the type of stuff that it's changing so that when I come back to it, I can just look at what I need. And I'm going to do img, and this is going to select all of my images, every image element. Now I'm going to put width, width, and I'm actually going to put 100% and then semicolon. And this is going to change that width to be 100% of that viewport. For some reason, you'll notice that there's this little white border around stuff. I haven't figured out how to change that, I'll be real. But now if I refresh, you'll notice I got some positive things that changed, also some negatives. So with this really stretched out icon, that oversized image is now fitting perfectly within our view. Our other ones came to be big as well, which is maybe what I wanted, maybe not. All of our icons are now super big. So let's go through and change those ones specifically. So we have our logos. So I have the ID of header logo and footer logo for this DL logo right here. And I want to return that to a normal size. So I will put a ID footer hyphen logo. And I'm also going to add my header logo. So remember to add another selector, you just do a comma and then a space. And then here I played around with some pixel values until I found what I wanted. So I did height and width both at 100 pixels. So that's like a square icon. The reason why when I save this and I refresh that it actually applied, and now it's the size that I want it to be, is that the ID selector is more specific than the element one. So even though those icons are both impacted by both of these sets of rules, because one of them is more specific than the other with that ID attribute, it's going to apply the styling to it and override the other one. Now I want to also change those card images for the project. So these ones right here, they're just a little too big for what I want. I'm eventually going to get them to be like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my class of card image. So period card hyphen image. You can also find it when you go to those images in the HTML. It's right here. And I put a width of 280 pixels and a height of 176 pixels. And while we're here, let's fix those social media icons at the bottom. I gave them all the class of social logo. So social hyphen logo. Whenever I'm doing my IDs or my classes, I always like to add hyphens in between the words, just so it's like one contiguous word. We don't have to bother with spaces and accidentally mess up some stuff. And for these, I'm going to put them at 50 pixels for a height and a width. Doesn't really matter what order you put them in. But the YouTube logo that I used is not a square. And so it's going to look a little funny if I save this and I show you. So it looks a little too squished for my liking. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the ID that I assigned to it. If we scroll down, I can see ID equals YouTube logo. So let's use that YouTube logo. The height is perfect. I still want it to be 50 pixels. You don't necessarily need to specify this because it's already being specified with the class. But then width, I do want it to be 70 pixels. So it's slightly more wide than tall. And if I save all, I can see that now it's the size that I want it to be. Cool. Any questions on anything that we went through? Cool. So that's what we're doing today. Next week, we're going to go through how to make this stuff be positioned more like this.